All right, students, welcome here. This is going to be a lecture for the live session on February 16th, kind of introducing some of the stuff from the Industrial Revolution that we have kind of dipped our toes into from the reading last week as well as from the urban game, right? To try and reinforce some of those ideas and add a couple new ones is what we're going to try and focus on here, looking at some of these topics here, right? Changes in technology and labor that come along with the Industrial Revolution, the advantages and changes that come along with things like working within a factory, the conditions within those factories and how they compared to a pre-industrial time, and then looking at industrial developments like the growth of big business, these transnational corporations that really get their start during the Industrial Revolution. Within those guided notes, there's a spot for you to watch this video. I'll post the slides later. I encourage you to. This video, Humans Need Not Apply, it's a great YouTube video that looks at what some economists, historians refer to as the fourth industrial revolution, what we're living through right now, right? The creep of technologies like true automation, right? Artificially intelligent machinery and things like self-driving cars, artificial intelligent computers that stand to take a lot of jobs from human beings, right? And put us kind of in this delicate situation that these people in the 17 and 1800s found themselves in as well. So it's a great video to kind of compare the two situations. We don't have time to kind of work it into class the way things are going right now, but if you get a chance to watch it on your own, I encourage you to. I think it's entertaining and enjoyable. But to start by talking about the Industrial Revolution, we should start by discussing an event that kind of overlaps with the Industrial Revolution in England and is a related and similar technological advancement known as the Second Agricultural Revolution. All right. The first agricultural revolution had been the discovery of agriculture or invention of agriculture or farming around 10,000 BCE. The second agricultural revolution involved the scientific and technological advancement of agriculture in a couple of the ways we'll kind of talk about here. Starting with this idea of the open field system giving way to enclosure and crop rotation. So European agriculture at the start of the industrial age, in the early 1700s, late 1600s, was still very feudal in its structure, right? A leftover from the Middle Ages. There was a lot of land being divided between, peasants and landlords, or the dukes and counts and whatever. The open field system, the medieval system, had many subsistence farmers farming these large fields that were often held in common, right, sort of held by the community, where they divided the produce amongst the community, all right, mixed in with, smaller private holdings held by a lot of individual peasants and the lands held by the lord of the manor, right? You can see that sort of depicted on images like this, where I believe it's the yellow lands would be the lands of the demesnes, right? The domain of the lord, the count or the duke or whoever sort of owned this fief. The white lands would be the lands sort of worked by his fief holders, by his vassals and peasants. And then the green land would be those commons that we looked at in the urban game or the Industrial Revolution game, right? Lands that were commonly held by everyone. This all goes away, right? Enclosure refers to a series of enclosure acts, right? Sort of laws passed by the British Parliament between the 1600s and early 1900s in Britain that sold off a lot of this, or eventually all of this common land, to private owners, typically already large, wealthy, farmers, right, that could afford to purchase even more land. Private ownership was and is generally considered more productive than communal or collective efforts because of the incentive of an individual to kind of maximize their profits if they worked hard, right? You don't have to split that money. If you put in extra time, you're going to maybe make extra profit, right? So the idea is if you could have one motivated, money hungry individual or whatever that owned all that land, he could use it more productively than a whole bunch of peasants sort of sharing the land communally with the idea that they're going to split that produce up, right? More efficient production, though, meant that fewer laborers were needed on each farm. Okay, so enclosing off and selling off to private owners this common land is one of the major consequences of the second agricultural revolution that's going to directly influence the industrial revolution. The displacement of all these now landless and unemployed peasant farmers to cities, right? People that lost their land either sold it to these big farmers buying up the common lands, or poor farmers that could no longer make ends meet with their small farm once their rights to the common land went away as well. These people became unemployed or like I said, sort of sold their lands off and became involved in this process known as urbanization, if we want to sound extra fancy, where they moved to cities in search of city work, right? So instead of being peasants, we get this kind of social change in the Industrial Revolution where these people become industrial workers, right? They become the working class, the new working class, something that didn't exist before. This idea, there's a link in here if you get a chance to go back through and click on some of these links and watch some of these videos that explains this idea of, common land or something being held communally versus privately by the phrase, the tragedy of the commons. This is used by philosophers to talk about this issue of collectively held land used by the community, used by everybody, versus privately held land. The tragedy here is the idea that when something belongs to everyone, no one really feels obliged or obligated to take care of it, like the ocean or air quality or, a lot of the sort of public lands we have that you see people throw their garbage into or trash. People overfish the oceans, right? We pollute and dump stuff in there because it kind of belongs to all of us. Nobody really feels any responsibility that they're the person that needs to take care of it, right? Somebody else is going to do it. It's kind of the idea. The video will give you sort of a better idea of that phrase, the tragedy of the commons. But it's often used as a defense for the privatization of natural resources like rivers or lakes or even the air itself, right? That if an individual owned that river or lake, they wouldn't let anybody pollute in it, right? They would say, that belongs to me. That belongs to the Nestle Water Company, right? You're not allowed to swim in my river or fish in this lake or do anything around it because we're going to use it to sell people water. We're going to take real good care of it and keep it pure. Okay, well, maybe, right? But then we sort of lose public access to that stuff, right? But that's sort of the defense for a lot of like privatization, is this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which becomes this kind of popular philosophical phrase around this time, right? Watch that video if you get a chance. It'll explain that a little bit better. But enclosure leads to these bigger farms, the displacement of peasants, and the growth of urbanization. Another development, kind of a related development, but another development was on these large farms, a practice known as crop rotation sort of reached its final stage of development, right? Kind of peaked in its effectiveness in the 18th century with what's called the four-field system. You might want to add that to your notes in there. When crops are grown, they leach vitamins and minerals and other nutrients from the soil. And the longer that you grow crops on the same spot of land, the less productive the soil becomes over time. Farmers will refer to this as soil exhaustion, right, or soil depletion. Crop rotation is the act of dividing your farm into sections and leaving one section fallow or empty, not growing on it, right? To allow the soil to recover, such as when, grass grows and dies and decomposes, right? Or bugs kind of wiggle in and die, or birds, poop on the field, or whatever it is, right? Giving it that space to recover allows some of the nutrients to replenish. Then the following season you can grow on there and you can get a lot more lifetime out of that soil by rotating your crops each season between it, right? So the Romans practiced that. They practiced a two-field system in the 400s and the 500s. Half the farm is growing a crop, whatever you want, wheat, barley, carrots, whatever. Half the field is fallow. Well, that's good. I mean, you're extending the lifetime of your farm, but you're only using 50% of your farm at any given time, right? Many medieval farms, a couple centuries later in Europe, practiced three-field crop rotation, where you're only leaving a third of the field of the farm fallow, and 2/3 of it are growing some other crop or two different crops, right? Four-field rotation is what is the big part of the second agricultural revolution, right? It's sort of the peak of the crop rotation system. So with a four-field system, no fields are fallow. You're growing something on every field, but you're making use of crops like clover or like soybeans that actually replenish nitrogen in the soil and sometimes other nutrients, and can be used to feed grazing animals or for a harvest on its own, right? If you're growing soybeans, if you're growing clover or something like that, you might, feed that to some other animal. But you would, imagine 4 fields, right? And one field is going to rotate through these 4 crops or some other assortment of crops each season, right? With, each crop sort of moving over to the next field and just literally sort of rotating through. So you're going to grow wheat on all 4 fields after 4 seasons, turnips on all 4 fields after, a whole cycle, etc. That's 4-field crop rotation, right? This is a way to minimize soil exhaustion and kind of maximize the productivity of your farm. Okay, so that's crop rotation, okay? With no fields fallow, that maximized productivity, all right, and led to an abundance of food like never before. Other things that increase food supply are things like land conversion, the drainage and reclamation of other lands, right? Like swamps, like marshes, things like that are drained and recovered. Sometimes pasture land for animals was converted into farmland, right? Less land for the animals to graze on, more land for growing food. And instead, you're going to feed these animals some kind of artificial feedstock, right, to fatten them up quicker instead of just letting them kind of graze around and eat grass. So draining swamps, marshes, that kind of land reclamation is estimated to have added something like 10 to 30% more farmland to Britain during this second agricultural revolution. Next is more scientific methods of selective breeding of livestock. All right, guys like Robert Bakewell and Thomas Koch, who I don't think you'll need to know their names, but these are the guys, introduced selective breeding as a kind of scientific practice, right? That sort of by mating together 2 animals with particularly desirable characteristics, in this case, large fat bodies or whatever that you're going to be able to eat a lot of, and also using things like inbreeding, right? Father and daughter or brother and sister mating to kind of keep those traits passing on, to kind of select for these desirable animal traits and programs throughout the mid-18th century. So some of the results of this, I found some statistics that the average weight of a bull sold for slaughter at this Smithfield, this English slaughterhouse, was reported in 1700 as 370 pounds, right, was the average cow size for slaughter. By 1786, weights of 840 pounds were reported, right? So a significant growth in the size of these animals. Next would be a continuation of something we've talked about over the last couple chapters, is the continuing spread of New World crops, things like corn, things like potatoes, which are very nutritious, very caloric, right? And give you a lot of calories per acre, some of the most calories per acre of any kind of crop. Those continue to spread, these New World crops. And also very much kind of like one of the other intersections of the Industrial Revolution and Agricultural Revolution is the increased use of machinery, which came up in our Urban Revolution, Industrial Revolution game as well. Things like seed drills invented by Jethro Tull, or reaping machines, horse-drawn cultivators, these mechanical devices that allowed one person or a small group of people to do much more work than a whole bunch of people could before, right? And there's all kinds of inventions that we're not going over. Your book mentions some, but yeah, the advances in these kind of like farm-based machinery technology is going a long way in improving food production as well. So that's the second agricultural revolution, right? And it connects in a couple ways to the Industrial Revolution in very important ways. They're sort of overlapping and feeding on each other, right? The Industrial Revolution is influencing the second agricultural revolution. The second agricultural revolution is influencing and helping the Industrial Revolution. Some examples of more recent fattening up of chickens between the 50s and 2000s, but using that same process of selective breeding and kind of genetic modification and stuff to get these larger, fatter, bigger animals that have more food on their bodies, basically, right? And mature much quicker. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution. Let me get all this stuff up here. The Industrial Revolution refers to the progressive growth of technology beginning around the 1750s through the 1850s, well, through the 1900s, we'll see, in Western Europe, which even continues today. Historians, economists today, like I showed you at that video at the start of the lecture here, say, talk about us being on the fourth Industrial Revolution. This first Industrial Revolution is characterized by, or was characterized by, the replacement of human labor with machine power, right? Whether it's a seed drill or horse-drawn cultivator or a spinning jenny or water frame, right, that we saw in our game we played. Historians divide the Industrial Revolution that we're talking about into at least two chunks, okay? The first Industrial Revolution that takes place between 1750 and 1850, and is focused on the growth of industries such as, coal, iron, railroads, and steam-powered ships and stuff like that. And most importantly, textiles, right? Textiles, coal, iron, those are the big industries in the first agricultural revolution. Remember that textiles are just, fabric, the creation of fabric and thread and so on. The second half that they split this up into, or the second industrial revolution, it's kind of the same thing, just running on together, is from like the 1860s, 1870s until the early 1900s. This is called the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution was focused on the kind of more advanced things, right? Oil instead of coal, right? So like the use of petroleum, steel instead of iron, things like electricity instead of simply steam power. And we'll see some inventions related to that. By the 1780s, the Industrial Revolution was kind of in full bloom, right? Starting to really take off in Britain is where it starts. So in Europe, and more specifically in Britain. Why Great Britain is something that your textbook spends a little bit of time on and is worth racing over really quickly here. Well, a couple things made Britain kind of an ideal spot for the Industrial Revolution. And they'll discuss some of these things in some of the crash course videos we watch as well. But the expansion of farmland is one thing, right? The expansion of farmland, better crops from the New World, better technology led to this giant increase in food supply, okay? The more food you have, the cheaper that food is, right? This is sort of supply and demand. What this means is that families were able to feed themselves for less money, and that meant they had more money left over to buy stuff. Well, the Industrial Revolution is going to be all about making a ton of stuff, making t-shirts and interchangeable parts for guns and little knickknacks for your kitchen and whatever, right? Just making all this stuff, soap, whatever. Because these people in England were spending relatively a lot less on feeding themselves, they had more money left over to buy this junk, right? To buy these industrial wonders. So that's one thing, is the agricultural revolution. The second agricultural revolution is part of why it happens here in Britain and not in, say, China, who might have been the place we expected to make this technological leap, right? Natural resources that were necessary for industrial technology were abundant and easily accessed in Britain. Things like rivers, were everywhere. Coal was right up on the surface level and easy to get to without digging these crazy mines, although they do dig crazy mines later. Iron ore, everywhere, right? They had a lot of sheep. They had all the stuff they needed, these resources, to get themselves involved in the coal or iron or textile industry in a big way. The other thing Britain really had going for it that other places, that not a lot of other places did, were colonial markets, right? Like literally colonies that under kind of mercantilism had to buy stuff from Britain, right? This is kind of before free trade capitalism. But under mercantilism, colonial markets gave Britain this advantage in selling off manufactured goods around the world. If they made too many t-shirts for their British consumers, they had colonies in whatever, in Argentina, in Jamaica, in India, obviously, right? Places like that, in Africa, that could buy these excess goods. They had probably the most powerful navy at that time. Up until probably, World War I, World War II, Britain had the strongest fleets in the world, which offered, a great deal of defense for that commerce and trade they're doing globally. And Britain also had a lot of laws protecting private property, right? Britain had laws that legally protected private property, sort of ensuring that entrepreneurs of the Industrial Revolution, these capitalist business owners, that the businesses they created and built up wouldn't be taken away by a mercantilist government or other, scheming individuals or something, right? There were laws in place to kind of protect the investments of these capitalist investors. Making it worth their risk, right? Next, some of the earliest inventions of the Industrial Revolution are things like the spinning jenny and the water-powered loom, right? The spinning jenny makes thread and yarn and stuff. The water-powered loom was like in our game, sort of the water wheel-powered looms that helped you weave cloth. They dramatically increased cotton production. Even before we get to like a steam engine version, they dramatically increased how much cotton and textiles were being produced by Britain. And they altered the position not just of Britain internationally in terms of economics, but also of other places like India or China or something, right? Lost their position in the global marketplace because of the introduction of some of this technology. And I'll show you some graphs and stuff about that here in a second. Perhaps the most important invention of the Industrial Revolution is the steam engine, which helped to directly increase coal and iron production. There's a series of people that invent things like the steam engine. You could go all the way back to the Roman Empire and find guys like Hero of Alexandria experimenting with, I don't even know how you say it, aliopiles or something, like little steam-powered toys. There's guys like Thomas Savery. There's a few guys, right, that are messing around with this technology. But the people that we give credit to for inventing the steam engine are Thomas Newcomen, who develops a couple steam engine devices between 1702 and 1712. Thomas Newcomen developed this inefficient engine that could pump water from coal mines, let you get to coal deeper in these mines easier, when it would flood and stuff like that. But it's 1769 when a guy called James Watt, like the watts on a light bulb, right? James Watt makes improvements to that Newcomen steam engine and produces more to sell. He makes kind of like the first commercially viable steam engine. This machine was an improved version that could be connected to all kinds of devices to replace the wind and water power and provide much more power to machinery to produce all kinds of stuff. All right. The steam engine helped the development of railroads, which are also probably right up there with one of the most important inventions of this age, but you don't really have the railroad without the steam engine and without sort of iron production, which is something they'll talk about in the crash course videos that you watch, is that industrialization kind of led to this feedback loop, right? The more you industrialize one area, the more you kind of had to or wanted to industrialize other areas, right? Making more iron lets you build railroad tracks. Building railroad tracks demanded more iron, right? And improvements in steam engines and things like that, right? It kind of fed back on itself. But the steam engine. In 1801, the first steam-powered locomotives are created by Richard Trevithick, I think in England as well. By the 1820s to 1840s, railway building explodes across Britain. They're laying out thousands of miles of track that are connecting rural areas to urban areas and allowing for cheaper transport than ever before. They're also building canals and things like that, like we saw in our game as well. And by the 1840s, 1850s, railway building is like in a manic stage in the USA. We're constructing our Transcontinental Railroad. A little bit later, the 1870s, 1890s, they're building the Transcontinental Railroad the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia in the 1870s, or kind of like 1890s, like I said. And it's kind of, through the railroads that we can really sort of track the spread of the Industrial Revolution, outside of Britain into some of these other places. It's also with railroads that we see, again, how much this era overlaps with this era of other revolutions. That it's also at this time that we have all these nationalist revolutions, like you watched the video on in 1848, right? Or the unification of Germany or Italy, things like that. These are also stimulated by things like the growth of railroads, right? That help people to form these national identities by connecting these distant places within a country, right? That maybe previously hadn't thought of themselves as one group of people, but now that you could get from this spot to that spot in 2 hours, in what would have taken you 3 or 4 days, you did feel a little bit more connected to those people that lived kind of far from you, right? And then let's see. So, like I said, these changes dramatically altered Britain's role in the world, as well as the role of some other countries in the world. All right, so take a minute to try and look at some of these. You know what? I don't know if I can move my screen here. I'm kind of blocking one of these things here. But if you get a chance to open this up after, so that you can kind of look at some of these charts. I think the video of me here is kind of blocking one of these charts. But this just kind of gives you an idea of the amount of growth we're talking about. That it's not just doubling or tripling or even like, it's exponential, right? It's like, and to the power of like 3 or 4 or 5, like very high, right? So this is raw cotton consumption in Great Britain in millions of pounds. So 3.5 million pounds in the 1760s, just what, 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, 166 million pounds, right? So that's not double or triple or something. That's a lot more that these people are consuming. Exports of cotton textiles from Great Britain, I don't really know what this, British pounds sterling, I think that's like a dollar amount basically, from 227 to 25,605, right? So this gigantic growth in production and what they're able to export around the world. You can also see down here when you're able to look at it that they're importing a lot less from other places, like India, who was pre-Industrial Revolution the world's largest supplier of textiles and cotton goods. Britain displaces them. They actually, you're gonna read in an article, and we'll kind of talk about later, they turn them into an importer, right? They take India from an exporter of textiles to an importer of textiles, and basically like a big plantation for Britain, right? Just kind of growing the raw materials Britain needed. This is iron production. Again, I mean, you can kind of just compare, China, who in the Middle Ages looked like they were going to be the people that had an industrial revolution first. In the 1500s, Europe, excluding Russia, altogether is making 60,000 tons of iron a year. 500 years before that, China's able to make more than double that, right? That changes really quickly. In the 1740s, kind of before the kind of industrial production of iron, Britain's making 17,000 tons a year. By the well, see, mine's covering it up here, but I want to say it's, in the 250,000s. And like 1806, they're making way more than this giant country of China or any of these other places were, right? Including that technology spreading to some other very large places, China, India, that managed to boost theirs a little bit, but nowhere near the degree that some of these places in Europe are going to be doing, all right? This is one of the very first steam-powered ships, you can see with sort of a smokestack, but still with sails just in case, that had these kind of paddle devices in the center of the ship that moved it around, right? So you were no longer sort of constrained by the wind. These steamships could go wherever they wanted, in whatever direction they wanted, and make a constant state of progress, right? And cut travel times from, months to a week or less, across some of these distances. I think I took this chart right from your textbook that shows the growth of railroad in two different eras, by the 1830s and by 1850. So you can kind of get an idea of who started when and kind of who got into it a little bit late. Obviously, Britain starts first, and then places like France, or excuse me, like Germany, when France finally kind of gets done with their revolutionary craziness, they are able to sort of like get in on this. You can see that during the time of kind of these revolutions, it's not going so great. But they pick up a little bit later. Italy, Russia, Austria-Hungary, some of these other places get the later start. But even then, by the middle of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution had spread throughout Europe, and even to a couple other places we'll talk about later, or that you'll read about this week, like Egypt, like parts of India, like Japan especially, we'll come back to and talk about on its own later. Okay, so rapid developments in technology like those, like the steam engine and steamships and stuff like that, became the new normal of the industrial age. And this expectation continues today. Think about our cell phones and stuff, how we expect, a new product every couple months now, right? Even if the technology from the last one hasn't even gotten old, right? I'm using an iPhone 8. This thing runs great, right? And people are 4-5 phones ahead, right, in terms of technology. So that becomes this standard, and this new standard, it continues, right? This wasn't the expectation before. People didn't expect a new, better sword design or a exponentially greater gun or cannon or something like that before this, right? You think about travel technology. The fastest you could go before something like a train was a horse. And 1,000 years before that, it was still a horse. And 2,000 years before that, it was still a horse. And go on. You can go 2,000 years more, right? It's still a horse. And then eventually, people had domesticated horses, and you just have to walk, right? But for a long time, the standard was things don't really change very quickly. Now we expect this kind of exponential growth, right? The growth of that technology allowed for ever more technology and improvements to be made, right? Steel production, for example, allowed for lighter, stronger things to be constructed, right? Suspension bridges, skyscrapers, things like that. You need steel in order to pull something like that off. And again, to kind of just show you what we're looking at here, Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium produced a combined total of something like 125,000 tons of steel, not iron, steel, which is stronger and lighter and better, in 1860. By 1913, that's 50 years later, it's 32 million tons. So again, like, I'm not good at the math, but that's more than 10 times, right? We're not talking double or triple or even, squared or cubed. It's a lot more, maybe cubed. Probably cubed, but it's a lot, right? Steam engines eventually led to, maybe even squared, actually, I guess, 125,000 times 125,000, but you get it. It's a lot more than doubling or tripling, right? Steam engines eventually led to the production of practical means to generate electricity, and with that, you're kind of in the middle of that second agricultural revolution, and you get this new power source that changes the world greatly by allowing a bunch of other inventions that rapidly kind of start catching us up to the modern world. So some of these inventions that really transform the world and kind of when they're invented. Things like the camera. The camera is, sort of popularized by the 1830s, and people are using cameras by the 1830s. The first photograph that you and I would both agree was like a photograph was taken in 1825, but it's really hard to lock down a specific inventor of the camera because camera technology, like a lot of this technology actually, evolved slowly over a century or more with a lot of contributors. You would have seen things that looked like cameras and that you could kind of take pictures of stuff with even before this, but that we wouldn't really call a camera exactly. So it's hard to say, who invented it and when exactly, right? But by the 1830s, people are using cameras and they work pretty similar to how cameras, not digital cameras, but how film-based cameras work today. By 1837, Samuel Morse invents the telegraph, and again, building on, other people's inventions. But like Morse code kind of telegraph, able to sort of send these telegraph messages. If you had a wire from one spot to another, you could have this almost instantaneous communication. Alexander Graham Bell invents a version of the telephone by 1876. Again, I gotta say, building on other people's inventions. Thomas Edison, again, building on other people's things, produces an incandescent light bulb powered by electricity in 1879. There's other versions of light bulbs that worked a little bit different, but were definitely light bulbs as early as 1802, all right? But we give Thomas Edison credit for that and other things. The radio, which is a super important one, right, is invented in 1901 by an Italian Guglielmo Marconi. Don't think I'm saying his name 100% right. By the 1870s, 1890s, people are experimenting with the first automobiles. Again, this is something you go back to the 1760s and find the first steam-powered automobile capable of moving people around, built by a French guy, Nicolas Joseph Cugnot. But by 1885, kind of around this time, Carl Benz, like Mercedes-Benz, developed a petrol or a gasoline-powered, internal combustion engine that's considered to be the first production vehicle. The first thing people could buy and drive around, right, was a benzo, all right? 1903, the Wright brothers fly the first airplane, the first legit airplane, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. 1903, they take the first airplane flight and fly, a football field or so. By 1969, right, 66 years later, people are going to be landing on the moon, right? People are going to be launching rockets and flying and landing on the moon, which means in one lifetime, you could have seen people going from never having flown to landing on the moon, which shows what we're talking about here in terms of the rapid development of technology, right? Case in point is the airplane. In less than a lifetime, people figure out flight and get to the moon. That's nuts. That's a science fiction story, right? So let's see. one of the first cameras, like this 1830s style camera, probably be about the size of your computer monitor if you're using like a desktop. Samuel Morse's telegraph machine, part of Alexander Graham Bell's first telephone. There's other stuff you'd hook up to it, kind of here. Thomas Edison with one of his kind of incandescent light bulb inventions here. I don't know if that's his first one there. Guglielmo Marconi with his radio. This is that steam-powered vehicle, like a car, which kind of looks like a car, right? But is a little clunky with this big steam engine up here. And but, you know, hey, ran on water and coal, right? Which is pretty good. There's also very early electric vehicles, right? You might know that now, that some of the very first vehicles were powered by electricity, and the internal combustion engine actually comes a little later. But this is the first Benzo. This is the Mercedes-Benz that becomes like the first production vehicle. But you can definitely see it's very much inspired by a horse-drawn buggy or something, right? The Wright brothers' first airplane. Do you remember what their first airplane was called, Jude? The Spirit of St. Louis? I think so. All right. The factory. Okay, moving on to some other stuff to try and wrap up here. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most production had been done at home by families. And the Industrial Revolution dramatically alters the way work is done and how people felt about it, really, right? Businessmen would hire families to produce items or spin and weave cotton and pay them by the amount that they completed. You read about this as the cottage industry or the putting out system. This is called, by economists, decentralized production, where, you know, so instead of production taking place in some centralized facility like a factory, it's decentralized. It's taking place in thousands of homes, you know, scattered all over. Everybody's spinning and weaving a couple yards of cloth a week or something like that. And then you all sell it back at this one big market. And that cloth merchant, you know, sort of takes all the stuff these families produced and sells it abroad, right? That's the cottage industry. And that's how a lot of what the work that's going to go into factories was done before factories, was this decentralized system of production involving lots of people, but in the privacy of their own homes and kind of scattered about in like local workshops and stuff like that. Most work had been agricultural as well, right? If you were doing a job as a commoner in pre-industrial society, you were probably involved in agriculture. You were probably a farmer on your own farm or somebody else's. The family had been the main structure in society, right? For your job training, for your education, counseling, you know, whatever, all that stuff took place within the family. New machines, though, like the water frame or the steam engine or things like that, were too large and too expensive for home use. And work was gradually moved to the site of these machines, giving way to the growth of centralized production, to use another fancy economics term, where production is centralized, right? Where it's all taking place in one spot, which is going to actually, you know, bring together all these workers in specialized tasks in one location and greatly improve production and efficiency, in large part because of how they divided up the work. Something known as the division of labor. This is something that Adam Smith talks about in his book, The Wealth of Nations. It's kind of a cornerstone of modern factories and production methods, right? The division of labor is basically an assembly line, a production process where each worker performs a single small task rather than completing a project from start to finish on their own. So once upon a time, you might have been a carpenter, right? You built furniture, you constructed a chair or a table, and you saw yourself in that creation, right? That was your handiwork. You were a craftsman, and you made it. Look at what I made. Look at this table, right? In the industrial era, you're a part of the machine, right? You, through the division of labor, you don't build a whole table anymore, but instead, sort of IKEA style, you screw the back right screw of the left back leg of this table, right? That's all you do. You don't know how to build a table. You just know how to turn this screw, right? You know how to put the tire on the Model T, but you don't know how to build a car. This is a kind of an assembly line, right? The division of labor, and one of the big kind of fundamental parts of a factory and why it works so well. This would be an example of kind of the cottage industry and, you know, people sort of spinning and weaving at home on their own time at a very small scale versus the kind of massive production that's going to be taking place in these factories. Factory labor kind of further leads to the growth of what's known as sort of industrial capitalism, right? This large-scale process of mass production of consumer goods that could be sold to people for a profit, right? Industrial capitalism. Some people that are involved in this, kind of from two different eras, right? From the early days and the later days, are Eli Whitney, an American, and Henry Ford, another American, okay, who both play important roles, but you know, separated by a century or more, right? Eli Whitney invented a bunch of things, right? He's most kind of famous for inventing the cotton gin sometimes, which was a simple device that helped process raw cotton and improve the, you know, thorns and impurities, you know, in the little cotton balls many times faster than could be done by hand by the slave workers that were picking the cotton at that time. There were a lot of thoughts, you know, that inventions like the cotton gin would reduce the need for slaves. The opposite actually turned out to be true, as planters realized that they could now process much more cotton than ever before, right? Before, there was kind of this bottleneck. If you grew 1,000 acres of cotton, you might only really be able to effectively process, you know, a couple hundred acres of that cotton in time to get it to market, right? With the cotton gin, this bottleneck was gone. Now, really quickly, one guy could spin a bunch of cotton through this cotton gin and clean it really quick, right? So there was no longer that bottleneck, and farmers expand their cotton farms and expand their amount of slaves due to this cotton gin device. It's kind of funny how, kind of morbidly funny, how it works out like that. So, Eli Whitney also creates, and kind of more importantly to us, creates the interchangeable part. All right. He makes these interchangeable parts in 1798 for firearms, right? And this was very like a revolutionary invention. Prior to Eli Whitney's creation of interchangeable parts for guns, weapons were handcrafted individually, right? You made each musket like you made a sword, right? It was crafted as an individual thing, and you couldn't take parts from one gun and put them on another. You had to take it to a gunsmith, and it was a very expensive, time-consuming process to repair a weapon like a musket. Eli Whitney crafts these firearm parts so that they could exchange between guns as needed, right? You could take the barrel off of this rifle or musket and put it on that rifle or musket and swap them, and it would work just fine. You could take the firing pin out of one and put it in the other, right? Take the trigger and swap all the parts out, given the same model of gun, right? The technique of interchangeable parts was copied by other entrepreneurs and used in other products for similar convenience, for cars, for radios, you know, whatever it is. This sort of standardization of a product and the use of interchangeable, mass-produced parts. And that became, you know, sort of the common way of industrial production, right? And goes along with that division of labor, right? In fact, like, you kind of need interchangeable parts and things to be very simple like this to even have the division of labor system, kind of assembly line system work, all right? So those contributions kind of get you to Henry Ford, who in the early 1900s is refining the assembly line for automobile production, right? His contribution is, instead of sort of people kind of passing things down as they finish their part of the task, he has a conveyor system, right? Like in this case, cars, right? Hooked onto conveyor belts, moving them through the factory. And people have just so much amount of time to get their part of this job done, to install the engine or put on the door or put on the tires or whatever, right? And you're just doing your one little part. Somebody puts the tires on, some other guy's screwing in the lug nuts or whatever, and so on, right? This Henry Ford refines, he doesn't create, he refines the assembly line for automobile production by using a conveyor belt system that moved cars through a factory at a regular pace and height and speed. Although even this probably has earlier examples, right, where this is part of the problem of the factories, that a lot of workers were trying to keep up with these machines, not vice versa. But Henry Ford is so effective at making this more efficient that the time it took to build a Model T on this assembly line went from 728 minutes down to 93 minutes, right? An hour and a half to put a whole car together and drive it out of the factory. I'm sure they get this done a little bit quicker today, maybe not with more complicated vehicles and stuff, but a very, very quick process, right? The mass production of these goods, right, using things like interchangeable parts, like assembly line style production with the division of labor, allowed you to produce things in such large scales that it actually kind of made the goods cheaper and more accessible. In economics, they talk about this as economies of scale. And that's the idea that sort of the more of something you do, the cheaper you can make stuff. I like to give the example of like a movie theater selling popcorn. Have you ever been to the movie theater? And I think they give this example in this link is where I'm getting that example. If you're able to click that link, there's an economics teacher that explains economies of scale. But if you've ever been to a movie theater and you get like you can get a small popcorn for $20, or you can get a large popcorn for $20.50, right? And it's like, well, why is it only 50 cents? It's different. The large popcorn's 3 times the size of the small popcorn. Why is it only 50 cents, right? It costs $20 to get to the small, and then only 50 cents more to get to the large. Like, how does that work? Well, economies of scale. Because a lot of the cost for that $20 popcorn is paying the worker, right? Paying the guy that's there popping the popcorn, buying the popcorn popping machine, buying the kernels, buying the boxes to put the popcorn in, getting the butter, etc., right? Paying for the repair of the machine, etc. There's all this stuff that gets you up to, we have to sell this for $20 to make a profit. But then once you have the machine, the kernels, the popcorn, the butter, the worker, all that stuff, it's not that hard to just sell more popcorn, right? So that kind of works with cars and clothes and all that stuff. You make one t-shirt, it's going to be real expensive, especially if you bought some crazy sewing machine and all that stuff. If you make 10,000 t-shirts, well, your expensive sewing machine, is kind of being used more efficiently now, and you can sell those t-shirts a lot cheaper. It's kind of the idea. Watch the video. They'll explain economies of scale, and you'll be more educated on the workings of the world and industrial economics, all right? The big thing here, right, is like kind of thinking about how this affects people's lives. This led to kind of a decreasing amount of input from specialists and artisans and a greater use of unskilled or non-skilled and machine labor and power, which is a big deal, okay? And that kind of gets us to some of the last stuff we'll look at in here are changes to labor, changes to people's lives and labor. Factories change the nature of labor for the common worker. Farmers, for example, had always had a great deal of work to do, but could work at their own pace. Entire communities or villages often worked the same plots of land as a group. And, long lunches, conversations, naps, having some beer, a little bit of wine on your lunch break, having your wife or your children present while you're doing this work was like a regular constant thing, right? And that all sounds very pleasant. Naps, beers, lunches, wives, children, right? All out there while you're bringing in the harvest with the rest of your village, right? It'd be a fun thing. You'd have a harvest festival or something maybe, right? in a lot of these rural areas and for these farmers who were subsistence farmers, compensation, your payment was the food itself most of the time, right? You paid your landlord with a cut of the grain or, some portion of the crop, and you kept the rest, and that was your payment. You used it to eat the cotton that you grew, you used it to make your clothes, or you traded some of the food you grew to get what you needed, but you weren't making a wage. Like, that was your life. That's how you made a living, is you grew food. There was something simple and pleasant about that for people. A farmer with a small plot of land was, in a sense, self-employed, right? You were kind of like a small business owner. You might be a terrible farmer, but you couldn't be fired or something like that, for example, right? Things like working by the hour, working for a wage, right? Didn't make a lot of sense when the harvest took an entire season, right? When growing and harvesting took an entire season. And when the compensation, also was sort of the food a lot of the time. So all that stuff is sort of going to be changed dramatically by movement to a factory instead of a farm. And maybe most importantly, something that's talked about by like Karl Marx and some of these socialists, these big critics of industrial capitalism that come along later, they're going to talk about stuff like this, right? These changes in lifestyle, something that we know nothing about, right? We don't know pre-industrial life. But for these people that are living in that transition period, they're able to look back and be like, my father used to tell me stories about the harvest festival, about everybody being together, drinking beer at lunchtime, having your wife and children in the field with you, and like being out in nature. One of the big changes of the Industrial Revolution is this loss of connection with nature, with our animals, with plants, with the seasons, right? And outdoor work. These are some paintings that I love that show just that, just what I'm talking about. Here's a community bringing in the harvest together, right? And you see all kinds of people sitting under a tree here, taking a nap, chilling hard, eating a lunch together, drinking booze, or who knows what they're drinking here. Some people still out there working, but there's kids, there's wives, and people running around, right? And you got your whole little community out here working together, getting some time in with each other. Here's another one, a very similar scene, right? These people hanging out, doing work together, drinking, eating, taking a break, relaxing in the sunlight. And then these are real photographs of people doing just that in the modern day in places that are not very industrialized. I think this is in Vietnam, but I could be wrong. It's in South or Southeast Asia somewhere. This is in the Middle East, I think, on a date farm. You got kids smoking cigarettes, drinking tea with their dad and grandfather, and taking a little break while they bring in the harvest of dates, right? Like, that's this kind of lifestyle that's lost to us that live in these industrialized parts of the world, which is more and more and more of the world every day. But there are still some places that are much less industrialized and kind of retain this connection to this old way of life. The working conditions in these factories is one of the other kind of big points we want to focus on and talk about. And I know this lecture is going on a little long. That's why I wanted to re-record it and make sure I could kind of do a good job on this. But working conditions lead to all kinds of changes. A stronger class system, for example. Workers, for example, could not afford factories of their own, so they were kind of made dependent on their employers and owners. Where in feudal times, and this is again something kind of Karl Marx talks about in Das Kapital and these kind of criticisms he writes about capitalism. Under feudalism, which we don't want to say is a good thing, but he argues, for example, that like the lord of the manor, your duke or count, kind of like was supposed to look out for you, right? You owed something to the lord or the duke, and they owed something to you. They were going to protect you and take care of you and protect you and so on. That's not the case with your factory owner, right? He doesn't owe you anything but a paycheck based on the work you do. And if you fall on hard times, you get sick for a couple weeks, you need some time off, this guy's likely to fire you and hire somebody else that's easier to work with, right? So it reinforces this class system of the rich being different from the poor, and kind of starts to separate this idea that the rich owe something to the poor, which was kind of part of the idea of being a nobleman. Even if they didn't always live it, there was this idea that the nobility owed something to the commoners, right? They had this obligation as nobles. Millionaires today, although they might do a lot for charity, don't necessarily think that same way, right? Work changed, right? From outdoor work with your community, with all kinds of smells and sights and seasons and all that stuff, to indoor, repetitious, boring, low-skill assembly line labor. Like I said, no longer are you making a table. Now you're just turning the back screw on the left leg, and it's not super satisfying for you as an individual, right? These workers were not connected to their work or to the products they were producing, right? They were just part of a machine, kind of. And still are, right? If you're making an iPhone or something like that today. Also, as part of that, it devalues workers as well, right? Workers were no longer valued as artisans or skilled people, just as labor, just as the work they could do. And so there was no reason to hire you or some other guy. Like I said, if you got sick one day and couldn't go to work, you didn't have any sick leave, you lost your job, another guy got your job, right? So that's very bad. Lastly is the pace of work. The pace of work changed dramatically. No longer was it governed by the seasons or by sunrise or sunset, by good weather or bad weather, like it might be on a farm. Now it was governed by clocks, by machines, by shop rules, right? Rain or shine, sick or healthy, you were going to work 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, maybe 7 days a week sometimes, for pennies. And injuries on the job became increasingly common as these exhausted, low-paid, worn-out workers were working with machinery that was clunking and pounding away at the end of the day just as much as it was at the start of the day. And injuries were very common. Even deaths on the job became common. Child labor. Related to this idea of stuff changing. Industrialization had a giant impact on the childhood experience. Pre-industrial society's children had always worked in the home, around their parents, on the farm, right? Children always worked. In fact, that's kind of why you had children, right? Was to help you do work on the farm and stuff like that. So there was nothing too new about this. When we're talking about child labor, in this case, we're talking about the use of children in industrial work, working in coal mines, working in factories, and with a kind of exploitation as the reason why you're doing it. Kids were being taken from their home, separated from their parents, which is a big difference from working on the farm with your parents, right, or something like that. Now you were a 6-year-old girl going to work in the textile factory, right? Your parents weren't there, just some factory manager who's hitting you and yelling at you and stuff like that, right? So this wasn't great. These were, again, long hours. Children were often beaten to work harder or to stay focused. Industrial workers and these children were exploited or taken advantage of, right? The idea is that families needed the extra income from their children, even if they hated how their kids were being treated. These factories would often only employ the women and children because they could pay them lower wages, like we saw in our urban game. And so there's an exploitation going on there. It's like, yeah, on the one hand, you're kind of providing a job for these people. They'll say the same thing about, sending a job to Vietnam or China. Well, hey, those people are making money, right? They have a job now they didn't have before. Well, yeah, but you only gave them the job because you can pay them 10 cents an hour or something, right? It's not because it's out of the goodness of your heart, right? Same thing. Like, yeah, these children are working. They're able to help their family, but only because they could be paid 1/4 of what you had to pay their dad or something, right? So families were kind of stuck in a situation where they had to have their kids work, even wanted their kids to work, because they were in such poverty. But by the 1840s, Britain began passing laws that would remove children from industrial labor and from the workplace in general, right? In the 1840s, they passed a law that said, children under 10 couldn't work in coal mines and factories, which is a start, all right? The Industrial Revolution can be credited with both exploiting children and helping to remove them from work and giving them childhood. It's kind of the modern idea of a childhood, that children shouldn't really work on a farm or in a factory, really begins with the Industrial Revolution, and this idea that you should be out there having fun, you should be going to school, you should be doing these things not work related, and save that for later in your life and kind of enjoy a childhood. That's an Industrial Revolution change. These changes were controversial, right? Like I said, among these families, children were banned from working, but wages didn't necessarily increase, right? They didn't start paying your mom and dad more because they stopped letting you work in the factory. Your parents had to pick up more hours. So there were just as many parents voting and protesting against the end of child labor as there were that were trying to keep child labor, right? Because they were in this exploitive situation. They needed that income and their wages weren't increasing. By the kind of end of the 19th century, by the 1880s, the need for a more educated and skilled workforce to work with these machines and in these factories in the late 19th century is one of the main reasons a lot of countries start public education programs. By 1881, there was mandatory education laws in place for children from 5 to 10 years old. Imagine being done with you're done with school at 10 years old. But public education is an Industrial Revolution thing that starts at this time, right? Because of the end of child labor. And then there's all kinds of great images. Remember, the camera's invented by this time, right? So we have all kinds of real world images of children working in these factories. I love these overalls. Look at that. That's like right on line with nipples right there. This is about as high as you can get some pants on this guy here. But look at this kid. I mean, this looks like he looks a little scared, right? Doesn't look like a happy place. All this machinery behind him. Tough kids dressed in rags standing next to these machines. Oh, I can't go back to it. But you saw those coal mining breaker boys. These are little girls that work with bricks, I think, but I mean, look, they look hardcore too. You would want to turn the other way on a road right here, right? You don't want to go down there. This kid's smoking cigarettes like a grown man. I think these are, they look like Newsies or something like that. But I think these are also breaker boys. I think these are coal mining kids. And this is one of the kids, building your clothes in Southeast Asia somewhere, right? This continues, right? It hasn't gone away. It's just relocated. Oh, more little niños doing the work. Okay, some reactions against this, right? And we'll talk about kind of more effective reactions later. But in the midst of these changes, one group that reacts to this in England becomes known as Luddites, right? Nowadays, we will use that same term, a Luddite, to talk about people that are kind of anti-technology. Luddites were English protesters between the 1811s, 1816, named after this supposedly fictitious leader of theirs, Ned Ludd, who would kind of disguise himself as a woman and go and destroy factories, right? These Luddites did that. They went and destroyed machines in factories to protest low wages, unemployment that were caused by these new, more efficient, productive machines like the spinning jenny, the water frame, steam engines, things like that. They would break into these factories and smash the machinery, break that stuff up to try and get their jobs back, right? Say, like, these things are killing us, right? Like, get rid of these things. I used to make this cloth, and now I don't. Now my family's in poverty, right? When I used to have a good job as a weaver or something. In 1813, in response to these Luddites, Britain passes a law called the Frame Breaking Act. And shortly after, the British government executes 14 of these Luddites by hanging, making machine breaking a capital crime, right? A death penalty crime in England through that Frame Breaking Act. So the government basically kind of choosing capital, private property, and profit over the social concerns, economic concerns of their citizens and workers. Karl Marx famous creator of communism, or kind of, one of these early socialists, has this great quote: the instrument of labor strikes down the laborer, right? The machines that the laborer uses are killing the laborer, both literally as these guys got hurt by machines, but then figuratively, like in the sense of these Luddites, right? Cast into poverty by the machines that displaced them. Okay, so to wrap this up, the actual last thing, all right, is to talk about the companies that dominate this industrial era, right? The transnational corporations, as we call them today, and as they come to be known then. In the 1850s, 1860s, governments in Britain and France created the legal foundations of the modern corporation with the passage of the Joint Stock Company Acts of 1844 and 1856. Before this, only a royal charter or an act of parliament could create a corporation or joint stock company, such as the East India Company of Britain from the 1600s. Now, with the passage of the Joint Stock Company Acts of 1844, 1856, you can just go to a lawyer or something like that, get the paperwork, and start your own, corporation, or like LLC, we would say today. And today it's still just as easy, right? You could go start a corporation tomorrow if you wanted, right? Corporations are legal entities, okay? They are legally defined and protected, and they can be kind of in all manner of forms and functions. They can be a company, which is mostly how we're going to be talking about them, an association of other individuals, a government corporation like you might find in China, or like, something like PBS or something like that, sort of like a public corporation. Certain types of charities, right, all might organize themselves as a corporation. For our purposes in this lecture and for this unit, we're mostly using corporations to talk about companies specifically, right? But their status as a corporation gives them special privileges that private individuals lack, okay? One of the first and kind of most important ones being limited liability, which we've talked about a little bit before when we first introduced joint stock companies. Limited liability is a way of minimizing risk and protecting investors and allowing for easier organization of these large enterprises. So to kind of explain this here, joint stock companies, like the British East India Company or something, are corporations that sell shares or stock of a company to the public. That's what a corporation does as well. Joint stock company, corporations, same thing, okay? A company, or this corporation, is managed on behalf of the shareholders, the people that purchase these stocks, by a board of directors, often with the explicit goal and responsibility of increasing value, increasing profit as much as possible for the shareholders. For example, companies will often pay out dividends to their shareholders by dividing up the profits of the business quarter in proportion to the number of shares held by an individual. So company makes a lot of money, you have a lot of shares, you get a lot of money from this dividend, right? You don't have a lot of shares, you get less money from the dividend. Even without dividends, even if you own stock in a company that doesn't pay dividends, investors profit when the company profits and their stock increases in value. So it's not so much because the company profited, but GameStop stock went way up, right? People that owned GameStop stock profited from that. If you sold it at more than you bought it, then you made a profit, right? If a company fails, though, not if it's being profitable, not if it's paying dividends, limited liability is about if a company fails. That's where limited liability comes in. The investors or shareholders are only liable for the amount of money they've invested, not the actual losses of the company, all right? You invest $100 in stocks, you can only lose $100, right? In fact, because the corporations have been recognized as legal persons, legal entities, since the time of the Industrial Revolution, in a sense, no one's really responsible for a corporation's losses or accidents or problems. If the company goes bankrupt from debt, no individual is held accountable to pay it back, right? The board of directors, the shareholders, they don't need to pay off that company's debts. They've got limited liability. That's why they got involved in this company that could loan out billions or trillions of dollars around the world with the knowledge that if something went wrong, they don't have to pay it back, right? This can also lead to problems, right? Like economic problems, depressions, bank bailouts, right? Companies being too big to fail, right? Like limited liability. Nobody gets in trouble when these companies make big mistakes. If the company is fined for exploiting workers, for damaging the environment, for causing political turmoil, for an oil spill that kills, 10 children and 1,000 whales or something, it's rare that any individual will be punished for these crimes, right? You can't try this corporation and give it the death penalty, and you can't try the CEO and give them the death penalty for killing those children and the whales with the spilt oil, right? Limited liability. Nobody gets in trouble, lets them take these risks, but otherwise, if you were transporting that oil and you might get arrested or have to pay a fine or something like that, maybe you wouldn't be willing to take that risk. Next, and I guess finally here, the industrial age corporations were often transnational, which meant they operated internationally, often with headquarters and legal authority in more than one country. All right, like Apple or something today that makes, is headquartered in San Francisco or something, or in California, sources the materials for their phones from all over, rare earth minerals, from Africa, and metals from this place, plastic from that place, whatever, puts the phones together in China and then sells them to consumers in Europe and America, maybe a little bit in China as well, and so on. In the industrial age, you have companies, some of the early kind of international companies are like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, right? Which was headquartered in England, but had legal authority to give loans and practice banking and stuff like that in their colony of Hong Kong, right? This British-owned bank that opened up business in its colony in Hong Kong and was authorized to do business in both regions, right? An international bank. The British Unilever Corporation, which you may have heard of, is still around today and produced in the late 1800s household goods, most famously soap, which they still make a lot of today. By 1890, it was super transnational. It had soap factories in the USA and Australia and Switzerland and Britain and elsewhere. It sourced its palm oil that it made a lot of the soap out of from British West Africa and later from the Belgian colonies in the Congo, making it, like I said, truly multinational in scope. By the end of the 19th century, businesses requiring large investments in land, labor, machinery were all corporations to help limit those liabilities and risk. Monopolies also develop in a large way during the Industrial Revolution. Businesses formed monopolies, or sometimes they're known as trusts or cartels or firms, to control competition as a way of controlling supply and demand, which let these corporations kind of set prices and increase their own profits, right? If the only place I can buy a phone from is if I buy an iPhone, I don't have an alternative of buying a cheaper Android or something, Apple can make those phones as expensive as they want, and people will have to pay them if you want a fancy smartphone, right? That's the idea of having a monopoly. There's kind of two kinds of monopolies we can look at. Both are common during the period of the Industrial Revolution, but maybe a horizontal integration kind of monopoly was more common. This is, let's say there's a bunch of different oil companies, British Petroleum, I don't know, whatever they are, Arco, Exxon, whatever it is, right? If you bought all those companies and put them all under your corporation, that's horizontal integration, right? Everybody in one area of a thing, all the different steel factories or oil refineries or whatever it is, computer chip makers, you're getting a horizontal monopoly, right? If anybody wants oil, they got to get it through your company. You can kind of set the price of the oil. This is sort of the idea between modern cartels like OPEC, right? These big organizations of oil producing countries that help set the price and amount of oil being produced. Vertical integration was also common. This is where you try to control not just one sector, all the oil refineries, but everything before and after the oil, right? So this example is looking at like a meat company that has a vertical monopoly. That means they own the farms where the cattle are raised, the slaughterhouses where they're killed, the refrigerated rail cars that transport them to the cooled warehouses where they're chopped up and packaged in the meat packing plants, the delivery wagons or refrigerated trucks or whatever that take them to the supermarkets, all along, like from point A to the very end of the line of making meat. That's a vertical integration sort of monopoly, right? There's lots of monopolies. We have very famous monopolies in U.S. history, like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, creating the giant oil and steel monopolies of U.S. Oil, Standard Oil, and U.S. Steel. Similar monopolistic companies were common throughout this era in the industrialized world, in Germany, in Britain, wherever. Corporate issues. The very last stuff has to do with the power of these corporations, okay? And I'm afraid if I click again, I'm going to get rid of this slide. But corporate issues. There is a conflict of interest oftentimes between the interests of the company, the profits they might make, their reputation, their control over a monopoly, versus the interests of citizens, workers, or a country. The ability of a corporation to operate both in the United States and China and make deals with both countries that are kind of like rivals of one another puts that corporation in a situation where it's not really loyal to either country, right? It's this truly transnational thing. It exists outside of countries and is almost a rival to countries. We'll see here in a second. The interest of a company to protect its profits oftentimes take precedence over the interests of its workers, right? Which you can also see in the low wages paid in a bunch of factories and stuff like that. Corporations and kind of corporate culture actively spread consumer culture, right? The culture of buying new things all the time, right? And the economic, psychological, environmental side effects of such consumption, right? The waste that's produced from buying cups of coffee, right, and throwing away all this plastic and garbage, or the just culture of like buying a new phone every year or something, even though it works just fine still, right? The technology hasn't even gotten old. That kind of spread of consumer culture, referring to you, customers, as consumers, right? It's kind of like the perspective of corporations on it. And the idea of corporate personhood is a big controversy in like modern day America, the United States. Corporate personhood is a big deal. The idea that a corporation itself acts as a person and can therefore be sued or sue people, can make contracts or can hold property, but because they aren't actually a real person, they're immortal, right? They can do this stuff for a lot longer and do some things that us as actual living, breathing people couldn't do. But they're also not responsible in the way that we are, right? They might get in trouble and have to pay a fine, a corporation, but again, a corporation can't be given the death penalty, can't be sent to prison, can't be truly made responsible for any of the crimes it might commit, knowingly or unknowingly, right? While you, however, could be in big trouble for crimes you knowingly or unknowingly commit, right? To make this issue even crazier, this is a list of the 100 wealthiest organizations in the world today, right? Just the organizations that have the most amount of revenue each year. And you will see the top 10 is mostly countries, big, rich, powerful countries that make a lot of money. But then when you get past top 10, keep it in mind that there's something like 193 countries in the world today. You will see the top 100 richest, most powerful organizations are not countries, but are corporations. That Walmart, if it wanted to and really invested the money in it, might be able to beat Denmark in a war. It's kind of nuts, right? That Walmart is richer than South Korea. I guess it's kind of crazy by a lot, right? And this is true of a lot of these corporations. This is even a couple years old. Probably I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of this list has even changed, and some of these places are probably even richer than they were before. It's probably more corporations, fewer countries on the list today. But I'll leave you with that. Hopefully this very long lecture helped you. Hopefully you were able to break it up into a couple chunks here. But that ends, part one of the Industrial Revolution lectures. The other ones will be, I'll make sure that they are much shorter and easier to go through. Thanks a lot, and have a good one.